For 1 week in late August 2018, families from North and South Korea were reunited. Some for the first time since the Korean War ceasefire in 1953. There have been just 20 such rounds of visits. It's a sign of diplomatic goodwill when relations between the North and South warm. Three months earlier was the historic first meeting of a U.S. sitting president and a North Korean leader. Each man agreeing to conduct a path to peace. But diplomatic efforts with North Korea by world powers have begun and stalled for decades. Will the U.S. and the two Koreas ever get it right? This is the story of the Korean Peninsula and finding a permanent peace, told by people who tried.
People love to compare diplomacy to chess because it seems so very rational and people really taking their time. There's basically two people sitting in a room thinking their moves out. I think diplomacy is more like billiards, where there are a bunch of balls in the middle of the table and somebody comes up with a cue stick and hits a ball in order to get it into a pocket on the other side. And along the way, the ball hits others, and it's horizontal and dynamic. And so with North Korea, what are the other effects? So one is, obviously, the relationship with China, Japan, and South Korea. I mean, it could affect many kind of in concentric circles reaching out. Plus, North Korea and the United States may not be the only people with a cue stick. So I think that it has all kinds of possibilities in terms of unintended consequences like billiards.
Why does North Korea continue to perplex and agitate the U.S. and our allies? It begins in 1948 with Kim Il-sung, a young revolutionary who will forge one of the most unique and isolated dictatorships on Earth. After World War II, two nations are arbitrarily born, divided at the 38th parallel, the Soviet-backed North and the US-backed South.
It's true that Kim Il-sung, he was a fighter. That's what he spent 10 years in Manchuria doing. And when he comes back to North Korea, he is fundamentally a revolutionary nationalist and not a communist. Ever since the army was formed in 1948, it's been the most powerful base of the Kim family's power, and it just dominates every aspect of North Korean society.
Kim will use the military to maintain a totalitarian grip on power. In June of 1950, in a bid to unify the peninsula, Kim's army invades the South. His army captures Seoul in 3 days. Fearing a communist takeover, US-led UN forces enter the Korean War. It will be a deadly affair on both sides.
There was no regard for civilian life. In North Korea, there were 8 or 9 million people at the start of the war, and they lost at least 2 million people. And about 70% of them were civilians.
After 3 years, the fighting ends. But the war shapes the North's political narrative.
It resulted in a universal hatred of the United States across North Korean society.
North Koreans believe a completely different view of what started the war and a completely different view of how it ended, in which Kim Il-sung led his troops to victory and vanquished the Americans and the South Koreans.
I always ask the North Korean officials, how is it that if the U.S. started it, that it was the North that reached Seoul within 3 days? And they've rarely encountered a heretic like myself, and so they really, their eyes kind of go wide at some of these questions. I think often they don't realize that there are these incongruous bits of information that don't really fit into their worldview.
For North Koreans, the Korean War is all about an American power that is constantly out to seek to crush them.
North Korea, much more than South Korea, is the inheritor of Korean political culture. They always kept foreigners at arm's length. It's not isolationism so much as exclusionism.
Out of this exclusionism, Kim developed a philosophy called Juche, that North Koreans need no outside influence or reliance. To a people that over centuries were occupied and invaded by imperial forces, Juche is a bold statement that resonates and rallies North Koreans behind Kim more than ever.
The leader is kind of this deity. We tend to think of North Korea as this geographical place, but in many ways it's ideology, or maybe more of a religion.
With unparalleled belief in Kim Il-sung, the war-torn North Korea rebuilt and flourished in post-war modernity.
North Korea has been an urban industrial society for a long time. The Japanese had begun industrialization there in the late 1930s with steel mills and iron factories, chemical plants.
If you go back and you read the now declassified intelligence estimates, at the end of the Korean War, they basically tell the story that the North will emerge as the great prosperous country, and the South will end up as a ward of the United States for a century.
They did come out of the Korean War and for the next 20 years sort of roar ahead with intensive industrialization supported by Stalin and growing at double-digit rates.
The economic boom funded a military state. Kim was building what will eventually be the fourth largest army in the world. A low-intensity war resumed between the North and South in the 1960s and 70s. Numerous incidents, assassination attempts, skirmishes along the border, heated political tensions.
And in the midst of this, Kim Il-sung seizes the Pueblo, which was an American spy ship.
I hope that the North Koreans will recognize the gravity of the situation which they have created.
They took the crew, marched them through the port of Wonsan with their hands over their heads. That was a cover of Newsweek right after this happened.
We are very shortly today taking the question before the Security Council of the United Nations.
Kim Il-sung kept the crew for 11 months and finally let them go when the U.S. apologized in one of the great choreographed North Korean-American negotiations, where the North Koreans said, the U.S. has apologized, and the U.S. said, we don't apologize, we just told them we apologized.
We could not apologize for actions which we did not believe took place. I will sign the document to free the crew, and only to free the crew.
That's how the crew finally came home.
The next year, in 1969, less than 3 months into his presidency, Richard Nixon is tested.
In power for just 88 days, the president now faces a most serious crisis in the shooting down of an American naval reconnaissance plane with 31 aboard over the Sea of Japan by 2 North Korean MiGs.
This attack was unprovoked, it was deliberate, it was without warning.
North Korea has threatened military action against South Korea and against our forces in South Korea.
They will be protected. This is not a threat, it is simply a statement of fact.
There would be no retaliation. Kim's control of the society was now firmly secured through brutality and carefully scripted propaganda.
I think it's hard to conceive of a country where the propaganda is so ubiquitous and where brainwashing has worked so well and where the controls are just so extreme.
In the 1980s, South Korea began to outpace the North's economy and was firmly allied with the U.S. The North orders a series of attacks on the South that lands them on the state sponsors of terrorism list. And the North's benefactor, the Soviet Union, begins to founder. Unable to support a modern society, the North built a nuclear reactor with help from the Soviets at the Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center. They claimed it was intended to produce electricity, and in 1985, they signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But that claim will prove false.
The North Koreans had been subsidized and helped by the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, the Russians took less and less of an interest in what was going on in North Korea.
Basically, the economy collapsed, but the regime didn't collapse because these people know how to hold on to power.
Soon, the Yongbyon reactor looked like a moneymaker.
I don't think Kim Il-sung really believed that nuclear weapons were going to be a salvation for North Korea. I think he thought they were useful as a bargaining chip with the U.S., which is exactly what he used them for.
In March 1993, the North threatened to pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Then President Bill Clinton was tested.
We were trying to figure out what we were going to do about the North Koreans pulling out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Ambassador Albright will be beginning her discussions today at the United Nations about a sanctions resolution which we propose, which would include phased sanctions designed to deal not only with the actions of the North Koreans to date, but as a deterrent to future destructive conduct.
North Korea threatened to pull out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They ultimately did. Probably the closest moment that the United States and South Korea came to resuming a conflict with the North, we plunged into what became the 1994 nuclear crisis.
In May of 1994, they took 8,000 fuel rods out of Yongbyon plutonium reactor. That was enough for multiple nuclear weapons.
This is indeed the gravest issue with which the Council is dealing.
Then, an unexpected surprise catches the administration off guard.
All of a sudden, somebody comes in and says, President Carter's on the television.
Jimmy Carter flew all the way to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Il-sung.
It was a surprise to us.
I think he will reaffirm our position. What I'm more hopeful of is that he will get a better sense from them about where they are, and that they will understand that we're very firm in our position.
I think it's perfectly possible it led the North Koreans to take some action.
Carter got a commitment to a freeze.
It wasn't that we disagreed or disapproved of what he was doing. It was just such a surprise that a former president would have gone off and done something like that.
If today's developments mean that North Korea is genuinely and verifiably prepared to freeze its nuclear program while talks go on, and we hope that is the case, then we would be willing to resume high-level talks.
I personally believe that the crisis is over, and I personally believe that Kim Il-sung wants to be sure that the crisis is over. The next step, obviously, is to make sure that the agreements that were worked out between me and him are carried out.
There is an alternative path, and a very good one for North Korea, that they don't have to become more isolated. They could become more engaged in the world in ways that would be much better for their own people.
Just weeks after Carter leaves Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung dies of a heart attack on July 9th, 1994. The nation loses their supreme leader, their father, their God. His son, Kim Jong-il, took power in the world's first communist dynastic handover. The people have a new deity, a new father, a dear leader. After months of negotiations, the Clinton administration and North Korea signed the agreed framework, meaning regular inspections and a freeze to nuclear weapon production.
This agreed framework was a deal that they would be back in the Non-Proliferation Treaty,
got a commitment to a nuclear freeze, which kept all their plutonium fuel, the 8,000 fuel rods, under UN inspection night and day for the next 8 years.
As part of this agreement, the United States was supplying the North Koreans with heavy fuel oil, and the United States, South Korea, and Japan agreed to build 2 light water reactors in North Korea, specifically designed to produce electricity.
At this point, it was an accomplishment, no question about it.
Then in 1998, another provocation from Kim Jong-il. The testing of an intermediate-range ballistic missile.
President Clinton felt that it was very important for us to have a full review of everything to do with North Korea. So he asked former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry to do a review of everything that was going on, trying to figure out what the North Koreans were up to.
Perry did a great deal in the next 2 years to engage North Korea and to transform American policy toward North Korea.
They would complete as a 200-megawatt reactor.
Perry said, I believe, in September 1998, we have to deal with North Korea not as we would like it to be, but as it is. When I heard that, I thought, aha, a ray of realism in the Korean situation.
He went to Pyongyang to talk to the North Koreans. He said to them, it's fork in the road time. We either can negotiate about what's going on in terms of your missile production, or we actually will be forced to use force and try to figure it out.
Secretary Albright.
And so what happened was the North Koreans said, let's negotiate.
If North Korea will forego long-range missiles as well as nuclear weapons, then we should be prepared, we the Allies, should be prepared to move step by step in a reciprocal fashion to normalization. Normalization of political relations, normalization of economic relations.
The United States is suspending restrictions on certain categories of non-military trade, financial transactions, travel, and diplomatic contacts with North Korea.
The number 2 guy, Vice Marshal Cho, came to my office as Secretary of State. He was dressed in a 3-piece pinstripe suit, very much a diplomat.
They worked out a deal saying neither country will have hostile relations with the other.
We ultimately did sign it. It was called the Albright-Cho Agreement. Later in the day, he changed into his uniform, and we went to the Oval Office. And he had a uniform with lots of medals and things, including one for fighting Americans during the Korean War.
They worked out a deal for an indirect buyout of North Korea's medium and long-range missiles.
So we're in the Oval, and he gives the president a folder in which was an invitation for President Clinton to go to North Korea. President Clinton said at some point maybe I would go, but this needs to be prepared, so I'm sending the Secretary of State. They weren't real thrilled about that at the beginning because they really wanted to have President Clinton there.
This first ever high-level visit from Pyongyang is another remarkable development in what has been a remarkable period.
Obviously, I'm going to go, but it was very difficult to figure out exactly what was going to happen because we had no embassy in Pyongyang.
Diplomacy is human beings talking to each other and reaching an agreement, showing respect for culture, letting the other side save face.
It is astonishing how skilled the North Korean civil service is. They are very subtle thinkers. They are deeply knowledgeable about everything going on in the U.S. These are really first-rate diplomats.
If we're not prepared, we don't have our act together, we put up unrealistic expectations, they're going to outsmart us.
First thing you do is you figure out who you're talking to and you figure out what they've said in the past.
I spent as much time as I possibly could learning about North Korea from the people that were the experts. Before I went, I talked to Kim Dae-jung, the new president of South Korea. He himself had gone to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Jong-il. He said, you're going to find he is not crazy. He knows what he's talking about. We wanted them to stop threatening with their ballistic missiles, and we wanted to make sure that they understood that they had obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty as well as under the agreed framework, and that they were not to develop nuclear weapons.
Kim Jong-il wanted cash, fuel, nuclear power generators. He wanted money.
They were hungry, and they also needed fuel, and we certainly didn't want them taking fuel rods out and beginning to extract plutonium from them.
2 weeks after the meeting with Vice Marshal Cho, Secretary Albright arrives in Pyongyang.
So we get there, and there's the normal kind of police escort clearing people from the streets. There was nobody on the streets. There were some people walking and a couple on bicycles, but they never looked at this motorcade, as if they saw motorcades all the time.
I've been to North Korea 8 times, and there's always a pattern. You arrive at the airport. They hand you your schedule. You don't tell them who you want to see. They tell you who they want you to see.
I was told that I had to go and pay my respects to the father of the country if I was going to get anywhere in any meeting. But if you bow too low, then you're criticized by the American press for being obsequious. And if you don't bow low enough, you haven't accomplished what you need to. So I must have been at the right angle, because they said, now the dear leader will see you. And then I was standing next to him, and I saw that I was the same height as he was. And I knew that I had on high heels, and then I looked over and he did too. And his hair was a lot poofier than mine. We then did go to the meeting. He was not a stupid man. He really didn't turn to his experts in terms of technical things about the missiles and all that. So he did know an awful lot in terms of issues to do with missile limits. He didn't mince words about the fact that they had capabilities, but that they needed a missile in order to launch satellites. And then also that they did need currency.
The North Koreans don't negotiate like we do. They don't think like we do. They don't believe in quid pro quos.
You can't deal with everything in any negotiation. You build this one step at a time. The main problem are the nuclear weapons, and then you deal with the ballistic missiles and various other behavior.
You don't make a deal with them, I have found, unless there's an informal setting, like walking outside of a building, or a dinner, or smoking a cigar. You never cut a deal when you're negotiating formally.
All of a sudden he says to me, well, I have a surprise for you tonight. And I thought, I wonder what that is. We went to this huge arena. I was told there were like 200,000 people there. And then all of a sudden this incredible program began with most colorful costumes and gymnastics and people dancing in rows, and they had a flip card section. They were good enough at these flip cards that they could make the missile go up. Kim Jong-il, through an interpreter, said to me, that's the last one. My whole impression about everything was that it was quite professional, very well received by their own population, who were trained to clap in unison. As we left, the press said, so what did you think of it? And I said, it was very impressive. And then I kind of added later, only a dictator can make 100,000 people dance in step. So then we go to dinner. There was French wine and a lot of food. It was very interesting because there were lots of lights in the stadium. There were lots of lights, obviously, at this particular dinner, but then when you're out on the streets of Pyongyang, there was nothing.
The next day, as talks resume, the secretary brings up human rights.
I asked him about the condition of the population, and he knew that he had to do something different for his people. He didn't express great sorrow over his people or sympathy, but that they did need something different. The atmosphere was very good, frankly. I think the part that was really interesting was his desire to have some kind of a different relationship. And at that stage, he even indicated that we could keep our forces in South Korea. And so I felt that we had had very productive talks.
We have a moratorium on testing of all long-range missiles, and we obviously are continuing these very serious missile discussions. And I take what he said on these issues as serious in terms of his desire and ours to move forward.
Kim Jong-il said if Bill Clinton comes to Pyongyang next month, December, I will sign this deal, which limits missiles to 300 kilometers or 180 miles, which would have solved the missile problem at the same time that Clinton had solved the plutonium problem.
When we left office, the North Koreans did not have any more fissile material, they did not have ICBMs, and they did not have nuclear weapons.
That was a really good thing. There were international monitors in North Korea to make sure that their program wasn't operating.
For 9 years, North Korea did not produce a nuclear weapon.
But then we had the election that lasted 5 or 6 weeks. The Supreme Court, 5-4, decided George Bush was the president.
Foreign policy doesn't come in 4-year segments.
We change our teams as our new administrations come in. They keep the same team.
We are a democracy, and we the people change our government on a regular basis every 4 and 8 years. We're also a very noisy democracy. We shout and scream and argue with each other. It's wonderful. It's called democracy. They don't. They have a state organization that has been consistent with respect to its policies for the last 70 years, since they were created in 1948.
They had deep familiarity with the history of U.S.-North Korean relations, whereas American officials bouncing in and out tended to be much less knowledgeable.
The U.S., as a matter of policy during the Clinton years, was waiting for North Korea to collapse. The CIA director said that to Congress in 1995. It's no longer a question of whether North Korea would collapse, but when. The North Korean commander of their army shot back within 48 hours. It's no longer a case of whether there'll be another Korean war, but only when. Which is a very important exchange because it validates what I've always believed, and that is the North Koreans will go down fighting if they think they're going down.
We were somewhat behind in terms of the fuel deliveries. And so the North Koreans felt that it was possible for them to begin developing ballistic missiles.
North Korea has lied to us, has cheated us. We indeed have likewise not fulfilled some of our obligations.
Agreements are cheated on, which is why you have verification processes. I did talk with Colin Powell, and I described in great length to him where we were, and Colin was very interested in it.
And I got a very good briefing. I understood what they were trying to do, and I have some background with North Korea, having commanded a battalion on the demilitarized zone many years ago. And so we took it all aboard, and so I was ready to sort of see if I could build on that. A little problem emerged, and that shortly after I became Secretary of State, I was hosting a group of European leaders out of the EU, and one of them asked me about it, and I said, well, we're going to see how we can build on what has been done. That was translated in the Washington Post the next day as Powell buys into Clinton policies, which caused me a big problem because the president had not agreed to that, and in fact, nobody really wanted to follow up on anything that Clinton had done.
They thought Clinton was appeasing the North Koreans, that these agreements were unverifiable.
As we look at the elements of the negotiation that the previous administration had left behind, there are some things there that are very promising. What was not there was a monitoring and verification regime of the kind that we would have to have in order to move forward in negotiations with such a regime.
You nail down what you can nail down. We had the plutonium nailed down. We thought we had the missiles nailed down. Maybe we couldn't verify every last one of them, but they weren't going to be testing.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
I really regretted the fact that we were not able to persuade the Bush people to go on.
American pundits on the left and the right just love to say North Korea never kept an agreement. But they kept it for 8 years, and in my view, the Bush administration was the primary actor in destroying that freeze.
The president and his associates claim that we'll do a year-long study of this, but there really wasn't a study. And so after a year, I went back to the president and said, look, I'm going to a meeting in Asia with all of the Asian nations there, and the North Koreans will be there. And we just can't let this sit. So with your permission, I'm going to reach out to the North Koreans. And he said, okay. So we sat down, and what I made clear to them was that President Bush is anxious to help the North Korean people. He knows that you have economic problems, you have food problems, you have other problems, and he wants to help. His motivation is one of humanitarian concern, not going to war with North Korea. But what we really have to talk about are some of the issues that are holding us back, i.e. your nuclear weapons program. And that was the beginning of a process. And then as the process started to develop, it occurred to me that rather than just making this North Korea, South Korea, and us, let's get the others in the region who have as much interest in North Korean nuclear programs as we do.
I could see from the South Koreans that they were very concerned that the U.S. was non-engaged. And so you could see opinion surveys in South Korea showing that somehow people were beginning to blame the United States for North Korea's nuclear ambitions.
When you have a South Korean president who's very interested in engaging the North, it brings pressure on the U.S. to engage the North, which we have never wanted to do, really.
Finally, the president sat down with the Chinese leader. The two of them agreed the U.S. couldn't do this alone. We needed other countries in the region to be engaged in it.
Both sides will continue to work toward a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula and a peaceful resolution of this issue.
Shortly thereafter, China stepped in with three-party talks, China, the U.S., and North Korea, to try to get diplomacy moving. And they also stage-managed what became the six-party talks, always held in Beijing, with China sort of chaperoning diplomats from Russia, Japan, the two Koreas, China, and the U.S.
The North Korean situation is one that can be resolved peacefully through diplomacy.
And as we were working on this and showing some progress, bam, we discovered that they had another program that we knew nothing about, the uranium enrichment program.
The North Koreans were continuing to make purchases of equipment and technology, which was consistent with the idea they might have had another way to a bomb with enriched uranium. The Bush administration basically said, look, we're not going to deal with these guys. And for some 3, almost 4 years, they didn't. You had a lot of people in the States who felt that any kind of contact with the North Koreans was in and of itself a bad idea.
John Bolton in particular, who was out to get rid of the North Korean regime.
The DPRK must open up to inspection and show that it is committed to a nuclear-free peninsula. That is what the agreed framework was intended to achieve. If the DPRK fails to do so promptly, the future of the agreed framework will be in serious doubt.
So instead of going to the North Koreans and saying, this is not acceptable, the Bush administration basically said the North can't be trusted, and the whole agreement unraveled.
On the subject of DPRK, North Korea, and its announcement today that it intends to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the United States condemns this action on the part of North Korea and also finds it very, very unfortunate.
During that period where there were no negotiations, the North Koreans merrily started producing more plutonium and actually made a lot of progress on their nuclear program.
Even with Russia, China, South Korea, and Japan in agreement, the six-party talks struggle to make progress.
It generally takes a long time to get diplomacy going, and in fact, through the first 6 months of 2005, we didn't have much traction at all, and the North Koreans had not come back to this new system of six-party talks. They regarded it as kind of ganging up on them 5-1.
Unfortunately, we don't yet have any signs that the DPRK attaches the same amount of importance to this process that China does and that we do and that ROK does and that Japan does and that the Russian Federation does.
Diplomacy is traditional. It's dialogue. It's cooperation. Find common ground.
Anyone who's ever been involved in diplomatic negotiations or family negotiations, it's kind of hard to do when you have 6 participants. In the case of the six-party talks, we had 5 different languages. And so the way that was done is you had this enormous 6-sided table, and then you had these huge white plastic tulips. As you began to speak, all the tulips would light up, meaning the interpreters were busy interpreting what you were saying in the other languages. So if you said, "Good morning, it's great to be here," you would look at the tulips in the center and make sure that each interpreter had finished, and you would know because the LED light had turned off. And then you would begin your second sentence, they'd all light up again. Needless to say, this is no way to talk to anybody. So we quickly determined that we would sometimes have a full plenary session in the morning with all 125 people, but we would quickly break up into bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral talks. We had to have a situation where we were talking one-on-one, and that was the way the six-party process proceeded.
The six-party talks, which went on for a few years, looked like a good venue for having these kinds of forums in Northeast Asian diplomacy.
It was pretty apparent to me from the first moment I met with the North Koreans that Kim Jong-il was following everything. So much so that when I was talking to my counterpart, Kim Gae-kwan, and I looked over to see what the note-taker was up to, I have never seen a note-taker work so hard in my life. So I figured that that note-taker was probably the person to talk to more than the head of the North Korean delegation.
I met Kim Jong-il very fleetingly once. He did not negotiate. He had his foreign ministry and his military people negotiate.
We finally had an agreement, but then a funny thing happened, which was that the U.S. announced new economic sanctions against North Korea.
Kim Jong-il might well have been completely put off by the Bush administration turning hostile.
We had a hiatus for about 18 months, during which the North Koreans refused to go to talks, and during which they also exploded their first nuclear device and fired off a few missiles, choosing July 4th, 2006 as the day to do that.
We overestimated how much time it would take for the country to build up a missile capability that could reach the continental United States, and how quickly they could build up a good-sized nuclear arsenal.
And then finally we got back together in about February 2007, and we were able to make progress implementing the agreement.
Kim agrees to shut down and seal the Yongbyon reactor and allow inspectors into the country.
Let me begin with a statement by the President. I am pleased with the agreements reached today at the six-party talks in Beijing. These talks represent the best opportunity to use diplomacy to address North Korea's nuclear programs. They reflect the common commitment of the participants to a Korean peninsula that is free of nuclear weapons. Hi, how are you?
When we went out to the reactor, you looked at this nuclear plant and you think to yourself, that thing is producing nuclear weapons?
That agreement led to the North Koreans blowing up the cooling towers at the Yongbyon plutonium facility in front of a lot of foreign reporters as an indication that they were going to go forward with an agreement with the U.S.
The disabling of these facilities is a sign that the North Koreans may in fact be ready to make a strategic choice.
I think that there are a lot of bumps on the road to implementation of this, and I'm sure the North Koreans will try and play it to their advantage, and that may be an opportunity to showing their bad faith, which I expect to be demonstrated quite shortly.
We did get them to shut down the reactor. We got them to do a number of things, but finally we were not able to complete the job because they would not allow us to verify things that we needed. And you know, there's no trust me in this game. It's all about verification.
Show us everything you've got. Until we know everything you've got, there can be no serious discussions. Tell us everything you've got, no more surprises. And let's see if we can get a deal out of this. And a deal that secures your sovereignty and your independence.
Obama initially also tried to do something with the North Koreans, but then he went into this strategic patience.
President Obama was the first president who said, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going into some long negotiation in order to go reach an agreement that we reached 10 or 15 years ago and pay the North Koreans again to do something that they agreed to do 10 or 15 years ago.
You know, that was probably a mistake too.
I don't like doing nothing. I think, you know, the six-party framework, it didn't break through, but I think it's always useful to talk to the other side of an argument. That's what diplomacy is all about. And sooner or later, maybe you can find the beginning of a solution.
In December 2011, the dear leader Kim Jong-il died unexpectedly, and his son Kim Jong-un was catapulted to deity status. Unlike his father, little is known, other than he was approximately 28 years old, untested, and perhaps not ready to lead a nation of such political and military complexity. He's rumored to be unpredictable and displays eccentricities like his friendship with NBA star Dennis Rodman. But Kim Jong-un proves to be savvy, shoring up his alliances by a brutal purge of the inner circle, including his uncle, publicly executed for crimes against the state, and accelerates the nuclear program, again in a bid to get American attention, in another provoke and get paid strategy.
It's the only thing of value that they have that we would engage in a conversation about and perhaps give them something for it.
In the fall of 2016, when President Obama first met with then-President-elect Trump, he said that the most urgent problem will likely be North Korea.
In 2017, North Korea undertook a charm offensive, and that enabled me to get another visa and return to North Korea and interview foreign ministry officials. But this time the mood was much bleaker. This was the aftermath of death of Otto Warmbier, the University of Virginia student. And there was much more propaganda in the Capitol. There were posters showing missiles striking the U.S. Capitol. The tone of people was that war is probably going to come, and it's too bad, but this is probably inevitable.
Antagonistic rhetoric fired back and forth between the two leaders.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
And then Mr. Trump comes in, and he takes a very hardcore view of the North Koreans, as I think he should. And the president saying things like, my button is bigger than his button, fire and fury. And frankly, the country went a little wacky about all of this. Are we going to war with North Korea? Give me one strategic reason why the North Koreans would suddenly wake up one day and think it's a good idea to drop a nuclear weapon on Waikiki or in San Francisco. It's tragic to think it might happen, but give me a strategic reason why they would do it, with a certain knowledge that they'd be committing assisted suicide.
The big strategic game for President Trump is, can you convince the Chinese that they're actually more at risk with the status quo than they would be if the regime went away? So far, no American president's been able to convince a Chinese leader of that.
China has the ignition key on the North Korean car, and they would never let them start a war in Northeast Asia. For what reason? What would China gain out of it? Nothing.
As the two nations come to terms, the Trump administration, some say, rushes to a summit with the two leaders.
Then suddenly we have this Singapore meeting where, wow, all is good. And we are where we are now, where all is not good because they still are producing nuclear material and maybe nuclear weapons. I really don't know that we know.
Since the Kim-Trump summit in June 2018, little has been accomplished with regard to the question of North Korea's nuclear program. Talks, as so often in the past, have stalled for the time being between the U.S. and the North. However, the South and North continue talks, strengthening relationships.
We have enormous interests with Russia with its thousands of nuclear warheads. Japan is a huge trading partner of the U.S. We have enormous interests with the 1.4 billion Chinese. So all of these other countries were extremely important to us, far more important than North Korea will ever be to us. But North Korea does have nuclear weapons, and so the issue absolutely needs to be addressed.
As the North celebrates its 70th anniversary, it also celebrates the Kims, its self-reliance, and its military strength.
Diplomacy is using conferences, using consultations, using a respect for the other person's opinion, whether you agree with it or not. It's trying to get along with people. It's trying to avoid wars. I've been known as a reluctant general. I am a reluctant general. I don't like war. Been in wars. Never quite turns out the way you thought it was going to turn out. So let's try to avoid wars. And let's try diplomacy. Let's try UN resolutions. Let's give the other side a way to get out.
North Korea remains an enigma, seemingly wanting to be on the world stage, but excluding outsiders, exhibiting a normalcy of its citizens, but maintaining inhumane prison camps, keeping a hold onto Kim family rule, but wanting to be a modern leader of a modern nation, all through propaganda, mythology, power, and fear.